Ladies and gentlemen, it's time to get it on. Get it on. Coming at you from a secret backwoods location in the middle of Texas. It's the highly opinionated and controversial voice of traditional old-school Orthodox Christianity. This is Spiritual Combat with Dr. Scott Sullivan.
Hello, and welcome to Spiritual Combat, the show where we engage the enemy using prayer, fasting, and full contact logic on the front lines and in the trenches, inviting you to join the resistance against the forces of lies, error, and evil. I am your host, Scott Sullivan, and welcome to the show. I don't know if you've noticed this, but a lot of the new atheist type people, the guys like, Richard Dawkins, I'm thinking of Lawrence Krauss, these sorts of guys, along with a lot of the atheist bloggers, the atheists in the blogosphere, these sorts of guys, they want to claim that they have this sort of intellectual high ground. That is to say, they think that, atheism, we are intellectually superior to you idiotic religious believers. And some of them, quite frankly, actually come out and say that. So I'm certainly not putting words into their mouths when I say that these guys think that they have some sort of intellectual high ground over people who claim to believe that there is, in fact, a God. However, that being said, though, I think that a lot of atheism can be shown to be irrational. That is to say that atheism, at least in many forms, is incoherent. Incoherent in a very strong sense. So to kind of drive this point home to you today, I want to talk to you about the incoherence of atheism. And I want to argue that the atheists do not have the intellectual high ground. They do not. In other words, if what I'm going to say today is correct, and of course I think it is, or else I wouldn't be saying it, if what I have to say today is correct, then atheism is not only lacking in the intellectual high ground, it is, at bottom, incoherent. That is, it does not make sense. It does not fit together. Now, by incoherent, though, I don't merely mean just confused. Incoherent can mean that. It can mean like confused or hard to understand. That's kind of a softer sense of the word incoherent. But when I say atheism, at least as it's expressed in many of its forms, when I say that's incoherent, I mean something stronger than that. Incoherent in a stronger sense. That is to say, it holds a set of beliefs that are inconsistent with one another. They are conflicting with one another. They are logically contradictory. That stronger sense of incoherent, a sort of logical incoherence, not just merely confused and hard to understand, but self-referentially inconsistent. That is logically contradictory. So you see, this is a stronger sense of incoherence. To give you an example of what I mean by this stronger sense of incoherence, let me give you some examples. Suppose I were to say, I have a triangle and it has four sides. I have a triangle and it has four sides. Those two statements, I have a triangle and it has four sides, are logically incoherent. They can't fit together. There can't be a triangle with four sides. That is logically incoherent. It is self-contradictory. Oh, suppose I were to say other things like, I'm a bachelor and I am married. Or this guy's father doesn't have any children. Or I know for sure that nobody knows anything. You see, these two statements do not fit well together. They butt heads They cancel each other out. When I say that nobody knows anything, and I know that for sure, those two things cancel each other out. So this gives you an example of what I mean by incoherence. Incoherent in the stronger sense where the beliefs just cancel each other out. And I have to say this too, that not all forms of atheism are incoherent in the way I'm getting ready to tell you about. You know, some philosophers, some atheistic philosophers are obviously smart enough to get around this problem. So I'm not denying that. I'm not building a straw man here. I'm not claiming that all atheistic positions are incoherent. But many are. I am saying that many atheists do fall into this position of incoherence that I am getting ready to tell you about. Many atheists do fall into this problem, especially the loudmouths in the blogosphere. Certainly these village atheists, this atheism in its most commonly expressed, unsophisticated form, falls into this category of incoherence. But also in its more educated representatives, for example, Richard Dawkins, I think, often will fall into this problem, even though he'll give lip service to something otherwise. Still, at the end of the day, I think he falls into the problem of incoherence. All right, so what is this incoherent atheism that I'm talking about? Well, it happens every time a person holds these two beliefs together. It arises from combining two ideas together. The first idea is what we might call naturalism, the idea that, well, it's all that exists is just the natural world, the physical natural world. God doesn't exist. All there is just the physical world, and that's all. Naturalism. So most atheists are obviously naturalists. All that exists is just the physical world, the natural world. There is no God. So that's the belief number one. And then belief number two, when that's combined with this other claim, something to the effect that everything we know must be proven by science. In other words, only the hard sciences lay claim to knowledge. Everything else is just opinion or emotions, blah, blah, blah. Okay? So those two beliefs, I'm going to say, are incoherent. It is incoherent to say, number one, that the only thing that exists is the physical world, and that's all, there is no God. And then number two, only hard science can lay claim to knowledge. I'm saying if you combine those two beliefs together, and doggone it, most of these atheist types do this. If you combine these two ideas together, you get a problem. You get a big, incoherent, logically incoherent problem. And a lot of atheists do seem to think this. They may not express it that way at the beginning. You may have to dig a little to find the problem, but at root, usually, not always, but usually you will find at the basis of one's atheism these two beliefs. Number one, that there is no God, all that exists is the natural physical world. And number two, only science can give us knowledge. Only the hard sciences like physics, chemistry, etc. Only those things give us knowledge. Nothing else produces anything that's worthy of the title, quote unquote, knowledge. So it come out in conversation. You're having a conversation with an atheist, and they say, "Hey, I don't believe in God. I just believe that there's just the physical natural world." And you say, "Really? Why? Why do you believe that?" Well, there's just no scientific evidence for God, etc. So the implicit assumption here is that if there is no scientific evidence for X is not true, or X does not exist. So it's the move that somewhere in the defense or justification of atheism, science is being brought in to support that. in some way or another, scientific evidence is being marshaled in to support the idea that, well, God doesn't exist. It's just the physical, natural world. So science is claimed to be a sort of justification for one's atheism. You're putting belief number one and belief number two together. Be more specific, belief number two is being brought in support of belief number one, the idea that God does not exist. There's just the physical, natural world. Now, you may be asking, well, okay, but why are those incoherent? And I would just say, well, think about it. I mean, if you have to, obviously don't do this while you're driving, but write these two things down. Write them down. Number one, God does not exist. All that there is just the physical, natural world. Number two, the only way we can know something is if it's proven by science. Do you see the problem? The physical world is all there is, and everything we know must be proven by science. And if you think about it this way, I think the conflict is pretty obvious. If everything must be proven by science, then what is the scientific proof that the physical world is all there is? I mean, if science could prove that the physical world is all there is, well then, shoot, you would have a scientific proof against God's existence, right? And that's pretty obvious. But how can science prove that? How could science possibly prove that God does not exist? How could science possibly prove that the physical, natural world is all there is? In other words, why is science being brought in here to justify the claim that God does not exist and all there is the natural physical world? How does science get us there? How does science really show that to be true? It can't, folks. It cannot. In principle, it's impossible for science to show that the physical, natural world is all there is. This is nothing to denigrate science. I love science. Science is great. Science is a wonderful method of acquiring knowledge. In no way am I saying that science is bad, or I'm not saying any of that. What I'm saying is that science cannot be brought in to justify the claim that the natural physical world is all there is. And this should be obvious. Science is, at least in principle, based upon empirical observation. You got to go out into the world and see how things work, and you can derive certain laws through inductive reasoning. You can learn about the law of gravity, or the Darwinian theory of evolution. You got to go look at the natural data and see what the world tells us. We learn by observance. There is nothing wrong with that. That's great. I'm all for it. But you cannot move from, well, I've observed the natural physical world, to the next thing and say, well, that natural physical world is all there is. That's crazy. That doesn't follow. That's as silly as saying, well, I've walked all through my house and I haven't seen a Ford truck. Therefore, there are no Ford trucks. I mean, you haven't even been searching in the relevant areas. According to classic Christianity, God is not a body, okay? He is a spirit, an immaterial person. And you don't find immaterial persons by looking at material things. You're looking for God in all the wrong places. So there is no way, even in principle, to prove that the physical world is all there is just by looking around. There's no way you can do that. Look around all you want. You can examine every star, every atom, every field, whatever. Examine the whole physical world. if you want, if you can. You will never arrive at the conclusion that, well, that's all there is. Everything that I've seen, that's all. That doesn't follow, okay? So, the people who think both that the physical world is all there is and everything we know must be demonstrated by science, these people have committed an intellectual error. It is a very grave intellectual error. This appeal to science is being marshaled in support of an atheistic claim, but it does not support it. It cannot support it, at least by itself, but that's what these guys typically try to do. Now, again, I got to say this again because I know there are people out there thinking, oh, Scott, you're just, you're building a straw man here, or this atheist over here, he's more sophisticated, he's got a better response. Yeah, I admit that. I admit there are better ways to state atheism, but typically, atheists don't do that. They commit this error I'm talking about very frequently, and not just by your average uneducated atheist either. I'm talking about educated people that should know better. Lawrence Krauss, for sure, commits this error. I mean, just watch his debates. It's crazy. All right, so the first claim here, the physical world is all there is, that claim is just kind of thrown out there. It doesn't have any support now. Science can't support it, so how can the atheist support it? Well, there isn't any scientific support. And quite frankly, I would add there isn't any philosophical support either, but put that aside. The position that we're talking about now that combines those two ideas, that first idea is unsupported. Number two does not support number one, right? An appeal to scientific evidence cannot support the claim that God does not exist and the physical world is all that there is. You're going to have more than that. But it gets worse. Because we can ask, well, why should we even believe number two? Why even believe the claim? Grant that number one is unsupported. That's the atheistic claim that it's just asserted. Number one is unsupported. But number two seems to be not just unsupported, but self-contradictory. Think about it. If I say everything we know must be based on a scientific proof, what is the scientific proof for what I just said? How can science support the view that everything we know must be proven by science? I mean, what are you going to do? You're going to take out a microscope or a telescope. You're going to do some math equations, come up with a formula or a model, and then therefore everything we know must be proven by science. How could you possibly even do that? There is no way that there can be scientific proof to show that everything we know must have scientific proof. That would even just be logically fallacious. That's arguing or reasoning in a circle. So the very claim itself that only science gives us knowledge, that claim can't be proven by science. It is self-contradictory, you see. It is self-refuting. It's as silly as saying, my brother is an only child. It doesn't make sense. It is incoherent. So all these popular atheists, these intellectuals like Dawkins and Lawrence Krauss and Sean Carroll, you'll get appeals to science all the time as if either it's implied or sometimes it's explicitly stated that science is fits with atheism and belief in God does not. That is not true. Not by any stretch. There is no conflict between science and believing in God. There is none. In other words, maybe to simplify this a little bit, atheism is a philosophical claim, not a scientific one. They do not have a monopoly on science. So this scientific pretense of some atheists, some of these guys on YouTube and stuff, is just silly. They do not hold the scientific high ground. They do not have a monopoly on science. They don't even hold the intellectual high ground. I would say there are many good reasons to think atheism is just false. But at least the most common form of atheism, and I say that from personal experience, the atheism, the naturalism I'm talking about to you today, at least that form is incoherent. The idea that the physical world is all there is no God, there is no evidence for that. There is certainly not any scientific evidence for that, but it can't be proven by science or philosophy. And the second claim, that everything we know must be proven by science, well, that's simply self-refuting. If that were true, we couldn't even know that statement itself. So at the end of the day, I think we need to say that this very common form of atheism that I am articulating, that we've kind of smoked out, that would have to come out in conversation. You're not going to get someone, you're not going to be in a conversation with an atheist and they come out and state these things like 1, 2. But you have to dig a little by questioning and so on. But I promise you, at root, at the bottom of all this, is these two statements are being bunched together. You just have to kind of dig a little. And you will see, I think, that this is a very common form of atheism, even amongst people who should know better. And this form of atheism it's a combination. It rests upon one unproven statement and another one that's just simply self-contradictory. That's why I say atheism, at least in this sense, is incoherent. And there are absolutely no grounds for people who believe in God to be intellectually intimidated by this nonsense. That's all we have time for today, folks. This is Scott Sullivan. Visit us on the web at www.scottmsullivan.com, where I have some more resources for you regarding Christian faith and apologetics, theology, and things of that nature. Also, don't forget to subscribe to our podcast. You can do that there on iTunes, or you can do it on your Droid device. Any device you have, you can subscribe to our podcast. That way you'll be notified when the next one comes out. I look forward to talking to you in the next episode of Spiritual Combat.
In your face with grace. You're listening to Spiritual Combat. Hardcore Catholic Radio. With Dr. Scott Sullivan. www.scottmsullivan.com.